I'm not sure if they are. Let me go on. Let me see if I can call it.
I spoke to them yesterday.
The Zoom is not up.
Today to have another event in Sustainable Economy Week. Welcome to everybody in the room here and those of you tuning in online. This is an event in the Colloquium in Sustainability Leadership sponsored by the GE Foundation. My name is Stuart DeCue. I'm the Program Director at the Yale Center for Business and the Environment, and it's co-sponsored with the Center for Industrial Ecology. As many of you may know, Marion Chertow, who heads that program in the room here. Marion, if you could raise your hand for anybody who doesn't know you. If you want to talk to Marion about her work afterwards, please go up and grab her. Today we're thrilled to host Andrew Winston, author of The Big Pivot, and an FES alum from 2003. And Andrew is a globally recognized thought leader on business and environment issues. And really, we were coming over, he was mentioning he inhabits a really interesting place in the world between people who want to try to think about how do you transform the system completely and blow it up, and those that are trying to struggle with the realities of a changing world, and how do you convince the kind of incremental change that needs to happen. So this tension between transformative innovation and incremental change and the place that he sits is one that a lot of the students between FES and SOM here struggle with and work on. You're going back between the two schools, taking classes at both, whether you're a joint degree student or other, and you're really trying to figure out the best ways to make that communication happen and how to convince people on the path. So we're really thrilled to have Andrew here today, to be able to host him, to dig into some of the insights of the Big Pivot and learn a little bit more about where his thinking is heading. So Andrew, many thanks for joining us today, and really interested and excited to hear the talk.
Great. Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. It's good to be here. I know I recognize some of the faces from the class before, but hopefully I'll cover some different territory. So yeah, as quick background, I did go to FES. Before that, I got an MBA at Columbia, I got an economics degree at Princeton. So I come from a business and environment shared kind of background. But my first part of my career was entirely in business consulting. I was at Boston Consulting Group, then I was in media companies doing biz dev and strategy and marketing, and wasn't in this world. And kind of had this career shift and value shift in like 2000. And found my way. Marion Chertow at FES kind of helped me find my way into FES because they didn't know what to do with my application when I applied because I had no green background whatsoever. And she convinced them to let me come do a one-year program, and I'm glad I did. So I came and started working with Marion and with Dan Esty, and Dan and I wrote Green to Gold together, and that book kind of kicked off my career. It came out 8 years ago. It sold over 100,000 copies in 8 languages, I think. It was the best-selling green business book of the last decade, according to Bloomberg. So it's done well, and it's shaped a lot of companies. But I think we need to have a deeper conversation, and that's kind of what the big pivot is about, and that's my new book. So that's what I want to talk to you about today. Kind of, pretty quickly, because I don't think this is a room probably filled with a lot of super skeptics, but I want to kind of cover the story of what am I saying are the kind of big issues we need to deal with. Why are we here? Why are companies even addressing environmental and social issues? So let me start from a slightly different place. So I have an old friend, college friend, who's a cardiologist now, and he told me something shocking, and I found the statistic, and it's true. 40% of first heart attacks are fatal. Now, for some people it's a total surprise, but for many, there were warning signs. Diabetes, obesity, family history, and luckily people see these warning signs quite often and do something about it. There's an article every month in Men's Health magazine they used to run regularly called The Belly Off Club that features someone like this man, Tom Larson, who lost 150 pounds. And every article has this kind of moment that they call the wake-up call. That's what they describe it as. This pivotal moment in the man's life where he realized something needed to change. He's running around, he's out of breath, he's with his kids, he can't chase them, or the doctor tells him he's going to die. So people do change, sometimes dramatically. They do what's necessary to thrive. Now what I believe is that the business community and our species, humanity, are getting wake-up calls. We're getting them. The question is, are we listening? And I see 3 really, really big ones. First, the world is getting more extreme in weather. Hotter, drier, wetter in some places, droughts, floods, everything. So last year, Australia had to change their weather maps and add 2 colors to their to the bands of their weather maps for 50 to 54 degrees centigrade, which is up to 130 degrees Fahrenheit. And as the comedian Stephen Colbert said, and I turned to him for insight and analysis, that's in January. Imagine what it's like in the summer. It's if we don't laugh, we cry, I suppose. But this is a funny way of saying things are kind of more extreme now. And there's pushback often, people in the business community who aren't so sure maybe about this climate change thing, that, the science isn't clear that it's connected to these extreme weather events. But actually the science is getting clearer. There's reports coming out recently, 5 different studies said this heat wave in Australia in particular is tied to climate change. We can start to tie these extreme events. And what we're hearing from new voices now, from politicians and business people, is that climate change is now costing us money. It isn't a model or prediction to debate, it's today. How many people here saw the Risky Business Report a few months ago? It's a really important document, very quick, easy read, speaks about it in a way that I really kind of feel compatible with, and it's the way I write about this stuff. It's from Mayor Mike Bloomberg, it's from 2 former U.S. Treasury Secretaries, Hank Paulson and Robert Rubin, Republican and Democrat. And they're saying this is already costing us money, and it's going to cost us a lot more. And the Pentagon is also telling us this is now a serious issue. It's not just a threat, which is what they've been saying for years, but it's an immediate threat. This is new. It's today. So we are now living in a hotter, more volatile world. Luckily, I think there is some activity going on. We're seeing a social movement at least happening. This march in New York, some of you I'm sure were there, was kind of amazing. The press didn't seem to care, but there were 400,000, 500,000 people there. It was a lot of people. I marched with my clients, my family on the right, and my clients at Unilever, at Ben & Jerry's. And this is my son with Ben and Jerry. Which is nice. I learned Jerry's a hugger. It was interesting. It got no press, but we were with Unilever and we didn't move. We moved 1 block in 2.5 hours because there were so many people coming from the sides and it just wasn't moving. Like there were so many people. It was a pretty big movement. Got very little attention, but there is an attention growing to this in the business community. So we are living in a hotter world and we're getting aware of that. We're also living in a world that's getting scarcer. It's getting more expensive. And I can give you some great examples of what's driving this, but the result is that the combined cost of everything going into society If you combine all the commodities, this is McKinsey data, metals, energy, food, etc., declined for 100 years with huge volatility, and then started rising dramatically in this century. Not every single commodity. There are metals, there are things that come down in price, but in total, the average cost of doing business has risen dramatically. Most companies have seen their major inputs double, triple in price. Most of them. Natural gas is kind of an exception, but even that's starting to come up now. So we're seeing a deep change in how the world works. In 10 years, we wiped out the productivity gains of 100. This is a paradigm shift in how business has to operate. They have to get leaner because things are just getting more expensive. So we're living in a scarcer or expensive time, but we're also living in a connected world. That's kind of a multiplier on these mega challenges. Every minute we share or have a couple million comments on Facebook. Every hour we upload 6,000 hours of video, and only 3,000 hours of that is cat related. Every day we tweet 500 million times. If anybody's tweeting, I'm Andrew Winston. Very logical. Every month, teenagers, US teenagers, text 4,000 times. You can do the math. It's a lot. But it's not just about random connection. We're actually using this connectivity. This is Sarah Kavanaugh, 17-year-old, featured in the New York Times. She, when she was 15, started a Change.org petition and got Coke and Pepsi to change their formula. It was a brominated ingredient that some people haven't been happy about. It's a pretty amazing thing. It didn't take a march, just one person on a computer, gathering people together. This connectivity is also allowing us to ask new questions. Everything about how a company operates up and down its value chain is coming into more public scrutiny. Questions coming at companies. Every consumer can start to ask, every business, more importantly, about each other's businesses, can ask, where's this product from? Who made it? Were they paid a living wage? Is it toxic? What's the carbon footprint? These questions are brewing, and more people are expecting to be able to get the answers to these at their fingertips. And there are increasingly tools to do so. So we're living in a more connected time. Now, I've been talking about a few big trends. I just want to put in context that there are other mega trends that the business community is particularly concerned about. I work with PwC regularly, and they did a big study that kind of boiled down the mega trends of the world into 5 big things that they're working on and thinking we have to have this infused in our thinking about how we consult, how we work with companies. Demographic and social change, that's population, that's the aging of the communities around the world, inequity issues, the shift in economic power from west to east. We see Obama over in APEC right now, trying to have a conversation with the growing part of the world. Urbanization, deep change, right? From a rural 100 years ago to now, over half the people in the world are in cities, and it's growing. They put together climate and resource scarcity, the 2 kind of big mega trends I talked about, and then technological breakthroughs. Kind of this connectivity is a big part of it, this transparency. I focus on these latter ones, not because the others are not important, but because I actually think if we don't get climate and resources right, the rest are moot. They're the kind of basic biophysical underpinnings. It's what Jonathan Port in the UK calls preconditional. Like, we can't solve social challenges if we don't have enough water or energy and resources. And this isn't just me, some sustainability guy, some guy interested in this, saying this. The world's leaders are prioritizing the same things. If you look at what the CEOs and political leaders, presidents of countries say, they get together in Davos, Switzerland every January. They ask them, what are the biggest risks? And you look at the top 10 from earlier this year, they fall into 2 clear buckets. The economy, they're worried about fiscal crises, unemployment, inequality. And then the second big bucket is climate and resources. 3 of the top 7 risks they named were, we're not going to tackle climate change, we're going to have more extreme weather, and water. Water is becoming a very big topic in business. I don't know if people realize there's just no water in parts of California now, right? Sao Paulo is out of water. Those are big issues. You can't operate a business without water. So my main theme, if anything, if you walk away with almost nothing else, is that the mega challenges, and I don't use the word sustainability much, I'm talking about actual physical challenges to the world. They create huge risk, but also huge opportunity. Managing these things are now core to business. It's not a side issue. This has become my mission for years, in both coming here to get a degree and then going out to companies to work with them for the last decade, is that they see this as core to the business. And I think increasingly the case is getting easier to make. But that also, this is not philanthropy. This whole agenda gets kind of squeezed together in most companies, and even more now than years before. There's kind of these cycles in organizations, and they've been squeezing back together environment and social, environment and CSR. More and more of my clients and big companies have put them together. I think it's kind of a mistake, because I think the philanthropic conversation or the citizenship conversation is a different one. What I'm talking about is the ability to operate and thrive. I mean, they're all connected, obviously, but I'm saying, do you have enough water? Do you have resources? What's your energy price? Do your customers have new demands in what they want from their products? That's just core business. We have to not talk about it as just the right thing to do. A lot of my clients, the CEOs, will say, oh, it's the right thing to do. And that's true, but it also kind of makes me cringe. Because the right thing to do is the easiest thing to cut when things get tight. And that happens too. But this is this unbelievable opportunity. Branson says it's the greatest wealth-generating opportunity of our time. Tackling climate change, building this clean economy. So, given the scale of challenges, this led me to write this new book, The Big Pivot, to make the case that we need a deep change, a reprioritization. Right now, businesses maximize short-term earnings and get to this social and environmental stuff when there's time, or there's easy wins, or there's enough pressure. We need to flip that. Manage our biggest challenges, operate in a way that tackles those, and work back from there. Find the tools of capitalism, competition, markets, and find the ways to do it most profitably. That's the book. I just told Marianne before, it just happened in the last few days. It was just named one of the best 7 business books of the year by Strategy and Business Magazine, which was really exciting. The other ones have all sold, I think, orders of magnitude more, so I've been telling audiences to get off their butts and get the book. You know, I've shown it to a bunch of companies. There's a bunch of companies using it, a bunch of schools adopting it. I mean, I'm excited about the reaction to it, but it's hard to get ideas out there now. We're all inundated. It's hard to get people to read a book. Right? I mean, business people are reading far less than they used to. Far more stuff, but they're reading emails and newsletters. It's just a different way of communicating. So more and more it's about kind of, I give these talks, I go out and I do videos, whatever. There's a whole bunch of ways to get to people. But the pivot is happening. We're already seeing a change. The bank HSBC says the market for the clean economy will be over $2 trillion by 2020. And we're spending at the government level around the world about $250 billion a year, $250 billion a year. It's a big change in the world. This is similar to the money we spent globally building out the mobile industry. And we take for granted now that in our hands, we hold a phone that has access to every piece of information in the world. We carry all of human knowledge with us. My kids, I have 2 young boys, you saw the picture. They asked me in the car last year, how many stars are in the universe? Now, until recently, fathers just made up answers to it. Just like that, 6.3 gazillion, And they said, ask Siri. They expect something so different in the world now. Right? You've seen this, I'm sure. So it's very different. You probably expect to just get whatever knowledge you want. So, but that came from a build-out, an investment. Trillions over the 90s and 2000s of a mobile backbone. Apple couldn't have made the iPhone without that investment. So we're seeing that level of investment, and it's growing in the clean economy. And my point is it's going to change life as dramatically as mobile has, as the technology has. We just don't know exactly what it will all look like. And there is recognition in the financial community that some of this is coming to pass. This was, I thought, fascinating. Earlier this year, Barclays Bank downgraded as an investment class all electric utilities because they said solar is getting cheaper and people are shifting to distributed generation and utilities are in trouble. They just downgraded them. I think it's amazing, right? The financial community is starting to kind of get this. So the big pivot. In the book, I've got kind of 10 key strategies, but I'm not going to talk about all of them. I'm going to leave 20 minutes or so at least for talk for us to discuss. There's 3 big buckets. There's a change in vision. How do we see the world? How do we think about the short and long term? How do we set goals? How do we innovate? What are the questions we're asking? A pivot in valuation, in value, not ethics value, but like putting numbers on things. This is what business is supposedly good at, but there's some huge gaps. How do we make investment decisions? What are we incentivizing people to do? How are we valuing natural capital? Really difficult. And then a pivot in how we partner, how we work with others. How we work with government, what we ask government to do for business. How we work with each other, collaborating radically, I call it. Getting companies to work with their competitors even. There's some great examples brewing. And then even talking to our customers and consumers about their footprints, talking to them, having a different conversation about consumption. But at its core, the 10th kind of strategy in the book is about building a resilient company. Resilience is a kind of hot word right now, and for good reason. This was the cover of HBR magazine in April. This was my cover story about resilience in a hotter world, about making the case that going down this path of things like more renewable energy makes you a more resilient, tough company. And this is not a side issue. When Hurricane Sandy hit the region, I live in southern Connecticut, I think we learned how fragile we are. The seas rushed into lower Manhattan, shutting down and putting into darkness the entire heart of the financial community for 4 days. because a part of the electric grid, a transponder, got wet and exploded. Now, call me crazy, but I think if your grid explodes when wet, it's not resilient. It's just not quite flexible. So I think we're learning the hard way that we need to move away from ancient fuels, old technologies. And countries are getting this. Europe has woken up to the very tough fact that 1/3 of their coal, oil, and natural gas comes from this man. This is my favorite picture of any world leader ever. Companies are also, you see in Germany, Switzerland, others move aggressively to renewables. This is part of the reason, right? How ridiculous is this? As I heard, I think Key and Peele called it a James Bond villain. I mean, it's just so bizarre to be reliant on that. So you see companies saying, okay, we need to move to the clean economy. Walmart is the largest buyer of renewable energy in the country outside of the military. And when they announced they were increasing their commitment another 600%, Walmart gets almost a quarter of their energy now from renewables. A bunch of that's from the grid. Like people know the grid's getting greener, like they have a lot of storm in Texas, there's a lot of wind. They make about 7 or 8% of their own power. When they announced they were increasing it, one of the top executives said something really critical. This helps us keep our stores up and running no matter what the weather is or who else might be down. So in that HBR piece, I talked about different kinds of resilience. This is what I call revenue resilience. We can still sell stuff. We're up and running. That's aggressive, right? That's competitive. If you're down because of the grid, we're not. This isn't just from solar. They have fuel cells. There's like a combination of things. But the other thing that I have found that business does not understand, they really don't, is that Walmart and many, many others in the business community are getting all this renewable power at no additional capital or cost. They're using what's called a power purchasing agreement, where you offer your roof up to a company that builds solar panels, puts them up, and you just pay for power per kilowatt hour, just like you would to the utility. You just shift some of your power. It's a hedging strategy against volatilely priced fuels. It's a diversification strategy of energy, and that matters to these guys a lot. So you're seeing the tech companies do this heavily. Most of the big tech companies have moved most of their data center energy to renewables. Apple's at 100%. But I want to make a kind of other point about this. So IKEA has done even more than Walmart. They're at 70% globally, 100% in the US. So in June, the Obama administration passed new laws on carbon and coal, which some say will raise the cost of grid-based energy, and it might. It's what restricting coal does. But if you're getting 70% of your energy from your own roof, how much do you care about carbon regulation? 70% less, like not much. This is a different kind of resilience, risk resilience. You have no risk if you have your own power source. So there's kind of 3 key principles in the book that I touch on to say this is kind of underpinning the big pivot and underpinning the building of resilience. Being decoupled, I'll talk about that in a second. Circular, building circular economies, and regenerative. These are related. And they're all kind of like nature. This is not a new idea. They've been around for billions of years. This is what industrial ecology is pretty much about. And you're hearing the leading companies talk about these principles. Nestle has been talking about this for years. Over the course of a decade, they decoupled. This is what they mean, decoupled growth, production. And companies still want to grow. And frankly, in a world that's going to 8 or 9 billion people, we're still going to need stuff. They decoupled it from inputs, energy, waste, water. This is how growth has to happen in a world of rising resource prices and constraints on carbon. And I would argue that Nestle's decoupled themselves from the market. This is the stock price versus the FTSE over that same decade. Now, it's not the direct reason, but it certainly looks similar. And I think anecdotally would say they haven't been hurt by this, because there's this, again, this assumption that green is expensive. It hasn't been, not for them. So let me talk about this vision. This is kind of the core of the discussion. We live in a very different world in terms of the pressure on companies. It's become the mantra that maximizing shareholder value is the point of a company. That's a fairly recent phenomenon in the last couple decades. It's not what companies were originally founded on, and in fact, the market has shifted dramatically. You know that more than half the shares now are traded, bought and sold in milliseconds, less than the blink of an eye, high-speed trading. That's not about fundamental value. Those people are not investing in the company. It's now a casino. That's what the market is. So a few companies have realized and started to push back. Unilever is kind of the most famous. Paul Pullman, the CEO, and I'm on Unilever's advisory board in the US, the sustainability board. And I'm a huge admirer of what they've done. They're featured in the book heavily. But as that caveat, I'll say what they've done is impressive. And this is one of the most amazing things. He told Wall Street like 4 years ago, I'm not talking to you quarterly anymore. And he said this great thing. He went to Davos and said, you know, if you buy into this model, we're going to grow through shared value, we're going to grow through sustainable investments and consumption, then invest with us. If you don't, I respect you as a human being, but don't put your money in our company, which is a nice way of saying I don't respect you as a human being. It was very well done. And there have been not too many to follow, but Tim Cook at Apple, also earlier this year, had an interesting conversation with a couple activist shareholders. They came in and were mad about all that renewable energy and green stuff Apple was doing. They said, stop investing. And he had an interesting answer that was right in some ways and wrong in others. He said basically, if you don't want me to do things, if you want me to do things only for short-term return on investment, then you should get out of this stock. Which, by the way, a CEO telling investors to get out of the stock is not normal. But he was saying, get out of here. Now, I wish he had said more. He said a little bit, but I wish he had said more that the green stuff they're doing is profitable. They've told me this, like all their renewable energy stuff has been good for them, good for business. That was the main message. But what he said was the larger story, which is not everything we do has a clear ROI. This one did, actually, the green stuff they were complaining about. But he was having a larger conversation about ROI, which I'll come back to because I think it's critical. But there is a larger kind of question here. In the green business or sustainability movement, why has almost nobody followed Pullman? Just 4 years ago. And it's a really tough question. And I get asked versions of this all the time. Why, if it's so great, why haven't other people pushed back on this quarterly stuff? Well, there's a lot of reasons. Incentives for CEOs are still very short term. They have options in stock that vest very quickly. That's a problem. The boards are incentivized, the investment community is incentivized, all very short term. This is not an easy problem to fix, but it's a big one. But part of the reason that Pullman did what he did is it's not always a satisfying answer, but it is just leadership. At some point, sometimes there's just leaders, and they just go a different way, they take a different path. So second, in addition to fighting short-termism, we need to set bold science-based goals. Companies set goals bottom up. Pretty much. What can each division do? What do they think they can do? But imagine if this room was filling with water or in a boat filling with water. What we would not do is say, hey, how much do you think you can bail today? And then we'll set a stretch target. No, we'd start bailing, but we'd figure out how much do we need to bail to stay afloat. We'd work back from what do we need to do. And on some problems, including carbon, we know now what the pace of change needs to be. If you believe this science, and PwC does, they have a report, and McKinsey has some similar numbers. The pace of change needs to be 6% a year in decarbonizing, meaning how much carbon for every dollar of GDP. Right now, the red line is how fast we go today, about 1% a year. It's been going on for a century. We get cleaner, we get more efficient, but that's not fast enough. The pace of change we need, given the cap on carbon, if you believe the science, is over 6%. It's actually 6.2% a year now. They just upped it, because when you miss a target, it gets harder. And that's how fast we need to go. Now, research I did, I have a database called pivotgoals.com that's all the goals of the largest companies in the world on sustainability issues. Research we did on how many of these companies have a goal that seems science equivalent. Is at the pace of change we need, and 50 of the Global 200, the Fortune Global 200, actually have a goal that's as fast as we need, which is more than I thought it would be, and was kind of optimistic. Now 50 is not 200, right? It's not fast enough. We need all of them. But there were some big goals in there. Going to renewables by X year, cutting greenhouse gases 40% by 2020, those kinds of goals, big goals. And there are companies that have used science to drive their business strategy. Ford has set their product development targets based on science. They figured out what did their products need to look like, their portfolio, to help the world meet its carbon reduction targets. Better engines, biofuels, electrification, and more. So they announced earlier this year, because of this strategy, that the Ford F-150 truck would be 700 pounds lighter in 2015 because they're moving from steel to aluminum. Now this is kind of risky, heretical work for them. They're taking their #1 selling vehicle, the best selling vehicle in the country, and the one that has a brand value of Ford Tough, and they're lightening it. That's kind of amazing. This is heretical, but I say, well, that's great, but also consider the hottest car company in the world, Tesla, is asking an even deeper question. Why do we need an internal combustion engine at all? It's a deeper, tougher question. That brings me to kind of heresy. Asking heretical, tough questions about how we do things. About everything from a particular product or process up to the whole business. What's the strategy of the business? So one example of operational heresy. Adidas announced last year that to dye our clothing globally, the apparel industry every 2 years uses as much water as sits in the Mediterranean Sea. That is by definition not sustainable. We can't clothe 9 billion people like that. There's not enough water, right? So they found a small company in Thailand. This is a great story of kind of startups and big companies coming together that has a dry dye technology using heat and pressure to dye clothing without water. Nike's doing the same thing. They invested and built a new facility that dyes clothing without water, zero wastewater, no process chemicals, less factory space, 40% faster, 2/3 less energy. This would be win, 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 win. Right? And you're off of water. You're not a little bit better, you're off of it. This is the kind of question, because the question they ask is, why do we need water to dye clothes? And the great thing about heretical questions is they sound silly at first and then they become the norm. You know, they become, over time you go, oh, that's just better business. So we can ask things about process like this, like, okay, why do we need water? It's a great question. All the way up to the point of the business. You probably saw this, CVS, $120 billion pharmacy chain, said we're not selling tobacco anymore. A couple months ago, they changed their name to CVS Health and stopped selling tobacco. They asked a heretical question. Can we stop selling products that don't fit our mission, our strategy of improving people's health? If we have clinics in the back of the store, how can we have tobacco in the front? This was a big deal. Actually, this to me is an example of a big pivot. It wasn't around biophysical kind of climate issues, but it was about a deep shift in the market that they're in around health. Now, in the newspapers, they reported that this was only $2 billion in sales of $120 billion, and they kind of poo-pooed it. That told me the reporter never worked in a company, because that $2 billion was not an easy conversation. I don't care who was involved, the CEO on down the board. This was a tough decision, there's no doubt. But it was an important one. And they said, you know, in a way, there are certain products that have no place in a prosperous, thriving future, and we don't want to be a part of it. Can we sell less? The flip side of that is, can we sell more of the stuff that does build a prosperous future? This is the idea of a regenerative business. Kingfisher is like Home Depot in Europe. Their business plan now is to be net positive, meaning they want to help people build buildings that generate more energy than they need, so that their existence actually cleans the grid, cleans the world. And I put up this busy picture of their homepage, or their website, because there's a share price here. It's not an NGO, they're not a privately held company. This is public. They think this is their path. This regenerative idea is their path to growth and prosperity. And by the way, it's physically possible. Seattle has this building, the Bullitt Center, that generates more energy than it needs. Like, we can do this now. We have the technologies. So let me turn to the valuation point. We have to change incentives. We have to talk differently about how we value things in business. Very quickly, the people side of business is incredibly undervalued all the time. But engagement matters a lot. The Gallup organization has done studies that show companies that have engaged people, care about what they're doing at work, are more profitable, they have lower turnover, they're more productive. And some companies have measured what this means in dollars. I'm surprised how few have done this, actually. SAP has said a % change in our retention rate is worth $81 million. PwC has measured the retention rates of the people that are most engaged with their employees in things like volunteering or green teams or whatever, anything they call CSR. And their retention rate is higher. They're happy. They're doing better work. It's worth $160 million a year to the company. So what engages people? Well, people more towards your generation, the millennial crowd. They are saying very clearly in survey after survey they want to go to a place that shares their values. They want values in the work they're going to do. Companies hear this a lot now from recruits. And during the heart of the recession, there was a survey that showed that 3/4 of global MBAs thought that this CSR stuff made business sense, financial business sense. That's very different than the current leadership of business, to think that there's a connection here. And I'm sorry to bring up another business school, but a colleague started a class at Harvard Business School called Reimagining Capitalism. I don't know if there's an elective like that at SOM, but she thought it's an elective, she'd get a few dozen signups. Well, 400 students signed up. So I keep telling people in the business world, you know that half of the graduating class of Harvard wants to reimagine capitalism? That's a sign. You guys can go out and change business. How many people are SOM? That's most. You gotta ask different questions, you're going to. This expectation that you're bringing to business, I think, is one of the most powerful forces out there. Now, there's another framework in the book I'm not going to spend a lot of time on about this valuation thing, which is to say that we don't value things in business. There are things we don't put numbers on that are critical. There's the whole world of externalities, like natural capital. That's a whole long conversation. But there's this other area that I find kind of compelling, which is internalized value. Actual value to the business, but it's just not measured. We don't often know how to. Things like employee loyalty, that resilience stuff I talked about, risk reduction, customer building, customer loyalty. And there are ways to kind of value it. It's getting better, but it's still difficult. And this unmeasured value is not a minor issue. This is a great study that said if you look at the market value of the S&P 500, 40 years ago, most of it was on the books, tangible assets. Today, the vast majority is intangible or indirect value, meaning all of the work of the CFO and accountants of the world to measure what's on the books and have all the numbers certified is for 19% of the value of the company. All the stuff we can't measure is the vast majority. That's a big deal. And that means that the companies that know how to maximize that value, even if they can't measure it well, are going to do better, because it's the majority. And I just want to say something strategic about return on investment as a tool. I use Unilever as an example of a great company, but they're a marketing, great sustainable focused company, but they're a marketing company too. A few years ago, they paid M&M, the rapper. They asked him to, endorse iced tea. They animated him, and then they put an ad on the Super Bowl. They ran it in the Super Bowl. How much did that all cost? They won't tell me. A lot. I'm going to go with a lot. A lot. So what's the ROI on a Super Bowl ad? We don't know. I was in marketing for years. We don't know. There's the famous line about half of all marketing is wasted. I just don't know which half. That's from a guy from 130 years ago or something. This has been a long-standing problem. So what's the ROI on marketing? What's the ROI on R&D? Or on entering a new market? This is the first Starbucks in China. How much did that cost? A lot. Sometimes directionally correct is good in business. A lot is a good number to know. What's the ROI on investing in natural capital or natural resources? We don't know, so we have to change, I think, and redefine and improve ROI. And I have a chapter on this, and there's a lot of ways to kind of think about it. One of the tools, one of them, is to think about hurdle rates differently. In business, every investment has to hit kind of a 2-year hurdle rate, has to pay back in 2 years, which is an arbitrary number. It really is. Different investments should have different hurdle rates. At Intel, they say that energy efficiency projects are allowed 5 years to pay back, and green building projects 7 years. It's more befitting of the assets they're investing in. The cost of capital should be different depending on what we're doing. Like a marketing projection, I've been in a meeting where a top executive said, yeah, we can do those 3 or 4 year payback energy projects, but that would then compete with capital that will pay back from we're going into Russia with this brand. It's almost word for word. We're going into Russia with this brand, it's going to pay back in 4 years. Okay, the former investment is physics. Like put a new boiler in, it's a 3-year payback. The other is that a marketing exec pulled it out of nowhere. 4-year payback in Russia. That's made up. I've been there. And yet we're giving them the same cost of capital. That's crazy. Because some of these investments are easy, some are quick payback for greening the business, some maybe take longer. But we got to figure out a way to do them anyways. So finally, we need to partner in a different way, I think. And this includes what I say is becoming a lobbyist. There's this group Series out of Boston. They work with companies to try to push the investment community to think differently about climate and other issues. They have a group called the Climate Declaration that you sign as a business and say, we care about this stuff. And then a subgroup, BICEP, which was started and originally had some kind of logical players like Nike and Starbucks, and then kind of the obvious guys, Ben & Jerry's and Patagonia, like the greeny guys. But what's happened in the last few months has been interesting. Some very mainstream companies have joined. General Mills, Kellogg's, Mars, there's a bunch, Nestle. And the Consumer Goods Forum, which represents $3 trillion in revenues, has also called publicly for a binding global climate deal. This is a change. Business has spent most of its history fighting all regulations, and now you've got some big companies saying, okay, this climate change thing may be a problem, we may have an issue, so we should do something about it, and we don't want to have 50 different state regulations. It's a big deal to get them, you're laughing, it's a big deal to get like CEOs to the it may be a problem stage. That's been a big shift in the last few years. And the World Bank during Climate Week in September issued this statement that they got 1,000 companies to sign in 70 countries, representing I think over half the world's GDP. They said we want a price on carbon. That's a big deal. This is a big deal. So I think we're moving towards something. It may not happen. I mean, the U.S. isn't going to be first. Not after this last election anyways, but it certainly wasn't going to be anyways. But we're going down this path. We're going to get to a price on carbon in some way. But there's a lot business can do in the meantime. There's something I talk about in the book that I'm already seeing happen, where business is becoming its own kind of form of regulator. Walmart and Target have both set very kind of strict goals on certain chemicals. People seen this? Walmart said there's a list of 10 chemicals, they're not being totally public about it, that their suppliers have to tell them if they're in any product within a couple years, be transparent about it, at least to Walmart, and then a couple years later get rid of them. Everyone kind of knows what they are, even though they haven't said it. It's like phthalates, BPA, these kinds of things that have grown to be areas of concern. Target has a kind of code and a scoring system for its products in the personal care area in particular. Same kind of thing, using REACH or other laws in Europe. They've said, here's a list of substances, something like thousands. We're going to give you negative points or 0 points if you have one of these. They're trying to push their suppliers, and they're saying, I talked to Target, that there is demand for the more organic and natural products. And that's the first time I've really heard that. There's been talk of consumers and that they don't really want this stuff, but Target's saying we don't have enough for our shelves. They're telling their suppliers, give us more products. That's a kind of change. But this is a form of, what I was using this phrase, and then I was speaking at an event with the head of the American Chemistry Council, and he came up and it was funny, we had the same phrase in the same almost slide. He said Walmart and Target are de facto regulators. Because the government's not banning phthalates, but Walmart is. That's a big deal. HP's told their supply chain you have to cut greenhouse gases 20%. General Mills, when they joined Bicep, said we're going to set goals for the supply chain based on science in the next 6 to 12 months. This is basically regulation. This is what companies can do kind of in the meantime, and they are getting ahead, frankly. I think companies are leading on many issues. Over 100 years ago this January, Henry Ford doubled the daily wage. Remember, didn't people know why? The story went to $5 a day. Why?
So his employees could buy cars.
That's the easy story. Some people push back and say it's because he was having labor problems, but either way. But yes, part of it was, a big part was, people needed more money. There wasn't a big enough middle class to afford cars. So you're seeing some companies say, yes, we're having debates about wages, but we're going to stop having this fight. The Gap just said we're going to raise the wage. And actually, as whatever you think about this election this week, the local voting was really interesting. 4 states voted to increase the minimum wage. We're seeing some movement here. But companies are just taking some stuff into their own hands. Starbucks, did you see this? Is providing college with ASU to workers. Like, this is kind of social good, common welfare stuff that companies are stepping in and having to take the lead on. I have a lot of opinions about this, about whether this should be necessary. I think it's kind of strange that they have to do this, right? I think, companies like McDonald's and Walmart that have so much wage pressure about, this topic, they must know, I know these executives, they must know that a thriving middle class is really important to them, and that wages need to go up. So I can't figure out why they're not lobbying for a rise in wages so that the whole industry has to pay more. Because the logic of not raising your own wages is, well, you'll be disadvantaged. But people can't live on $7 an hour. So I think you see some companies starting to step into the breach. And you see companies working together radically, as I said. Coke realized a while ago that one of their big footprint issues was HFCs in refrigerants. How do we keep drinks cold? So they started working with Unilever and with the Consumer Goods Forum and with Pepsi. That's a big deal. This is the #1 business rivalry in history, according to Fortune magazine. And they're working together. The heretical question is, can we collaborate with our fiercest competitors? Yes. We can, because the real issue is, what do we compete on? Do we compete on keeping drinks cold? No. So you see companies coming together. Walmart and Target held a summit in September around the personal care industry, together hosting chemical companies and big consumer products companies to say, how do we make this more sustainable? We saw during Climate Week another announcement, New York Declaration on Forests, a group of countries, regions, and a few small, little-known brands that said they were going to end deforestation by 2030. It's a big deal. Big companies saying, let's work together. Let's figure out how to do this together. Now, there are some companies that I think are asking an even larger, deeper question. They're trying to connect what they do and their products to a larger purpose, like bringing energy and water to the developing world, or like Unilever's doing, teaching hand-washing skills around the world to save young lives from easily preventable diseases. Now, this seems like philanthropy. I said before, this isn't about philanthropy. Now, of course, there's a part of it that is. But there's also kind of a cold, hard business logic here, I truly believe. And what Unilever gets, that very few companies have kind of internalized. And this sounds awful, but if you're not like saving kids and keeping them alive, then they're not going to grow up to be contributing to society. They're not going to be employees or customers. If you're not getting energy and water to places, they can't buy computers, they can't buy detergent. There's no growth, there's no economy. What this comes down to is what many have said in different ways. Business cannot thrive unless the planet and society thrive. We're not separate. Business is not separate from the biggest problems of the world. So I ask business leaders, I go around the world, have this conversation with them. What are you doing? What's the question you need to ask to challenge the way you do business in a fundamental way? We need business leaders to come up with big new solutions. We need the next leaders, you guys, to come up with products and services that help build a prosperous world in a way that's sustainable. So what's your heresy? What if our future depended on the answers? Because it does. Thank you. All right. That was 40, so I've got like 15, 20 minutes. Or you guys can go eat. Questions?
If you could go back
Caroline,
to
can you make sure to use the microphone and introduce yourself?
if you could go back to the slide where you have the 3 pillars, I think it was one of your.
Yep. Let's see. It's a little further than I thought. You mean of the big pivot pillars, right?
Yeah, the one. Yeah, this one. Okay. So I had a question about the partner pivot, and basically, a lot of the companies you mentioned are working directly with customers, so B2C companies, so Walmart, Target, etc. And they're putting pressure on their supplier to release all of these. Can you talk a little bit about how that is different with a company that maybe a B2B or like a company that's not as well known or is transparent directly to customers? You mentioned HP, but I was just wondering if you could elaborate more.
Let's step back. So Walmart and Target are dealing with customers, but people also put in the B2C category all the consumer products companies, Unilever and P&G. But in this conversation, they're B2B. They're selling to Walmart and Target. When they talk about their customers internally, they mean Walmart. Like, they talk about moms and buying products, but their bigger customer in their head is already getting on the shelves of Walmart. So they're both. So there's a huge chunk of the economy that isn't easily called B2C. I think that's the first thing. You got to think they are thinking B2B in many, many ways. But there's the whole tech sector that's fundamentally B2B, that's selling to business or selling components to other parts of the value chain. All these conversations are happening. I said that the tech industry is going kind of to renewables quicker than anybody. The pressure isn't coming from consumers. So it isn't because Walmart and Target are facing consumers exactly that they're doing this. There's a lot of reasons that they're going down this path. I think reducing risk is something they care about, reducing the costs upstream. But it's actually kind of an interesting strategic question that I always have about the greening of business movement. You could argue it's weird that it's even happening, because if the pressure is coming from Walmart and Target, it hasn't been coming from consumers. So there is some question as to why it even happens, frankly. There is some aspect that I think they do think it's the right thing to do, or they're seeing kind of long-term risk. But the B2B world, I think, is where there's actually much more pressure. The questions about the supply chain are coming in a much more kind of concerted way up the supply chain. They're coming through increased audits, shared audits across sectors. The apparel industry is doing a ton around, kind of indices and developing tools, the Sustainable Apparel Coalition. And you can say, okay, well, there's also B2C, but 70% of the economy is consumption. So it's kind of hard to get away from there's an end product that a consumer buys, right? Like that is 70% of the economy. So, I don't think we have to prove that it's that different between B2C and B2B, but I think the B2B conversation is actually a lot more intense because they kind of can push each other in a different way. So I don't know if that answered your question, but there's whole sectors that are moving just as fast, and I think tech is probably the best example.
Thanks for coming. My name is Thomas. I'm a second-year joint degree. My question is actually not that dissimilar from Caroline's in that, it's nice to talk about some of these innovative leading companies and all the interesting stuff they're doing. But I guess I'm wondering when you think we'll see similar engagement from, Exxon or Chesapeake or Koch Industries, because this isn't just going to be solved by tech companies and consumer packaged goods companies.
That's a larger question. I don't think you're going to engage Coke. Some companies are just going to lose out. And look, there's a market transition coming, and it's already developing. I don't think people realize that about half the energy being put on the grid globally now is renewables. Renewables are actually already winning.
Yeah, you're not plugged in at all. Here we go.
Or have I not been plugged in? Do I have to start over?
Also,
So
Is-
does that
is
mean
that
we didn't
true?
get
My-
any of
my-
we didn't get any of the
We
whole?
did pick up some
Oh.
of the ambient.
Sorry.
my understanding was that like we're probably generating, I don't know, 4 or 5% of our energy from renewable sources, not 50, not even close to 50.
No, you misunderstood. The amount of put on the grid, the new
New capacity
investment.
installed per year.
Right. So the criticism that renewables are a tiny percentage now, I hear all the time, but it's a strange criticism because you don't go from 0 to 100. Like there's always a start of an industry where it's small, right? The percentage of households that had a car was low at one point. But my point is, at some point, you're adding, the entire growth is coming in the new technologies. So the current old guard of energy has a hard choice. They're going to continue to make money for a while. They certainly will, but they're going to disappear. Coal's dying. The writing's on the wall, and the coal utilities know it. The coal companies are in denial, and they're happy with the new leadership in the Senate. The Kentucky-led Senate is great for them in the short run, but we're moving away from those fuels. So I don't think we need to bring around Coke or Exxon. Exxon's actually drawn a line in the sand. They said this spring, they put out a document, we talked about this before, about stranded assets. They said, we're not going to have assets that are not valuable because no one's going to regulate us, and tough. They put their line in the sand, and I actually think what's happening now is the rest of the business world is starting to wake up to the fact that the vision that Unilever has or others have of a sustainable future is at direct odds with Exxon's until Exxon or Shell or some others kind of make their own pivot. They either have to pivot to saying we're an energy provider and we're going to provide energy no matter what it is and we're going to move to clean energy, or they start to disappear over time. That's just where we're headed. And there's kind of, I think the Koch brothers, we're not going to convince the Koch brothers. I don't think we should waste time on that. They're not going to come along. They're going to either be defeated, or they're going to make a lot of money till they die, and then they're going to be defeated as a company. So I don't think you can convince everybody. You don't need to. And the reality is, the rest of the business community, I have this debate all the time with people who kind of just want to change the energy supply, and I agree with that. But the demand from companies for energy and from us as homeowners is what creates the energy demand. Like supply isn't just sitting there and then demand is separate. This is a market. So I think we're changing what we're demanding already pretty dramatically. The economics of the clean economy are getting better so fast that companies, whether they're skeptical or not, they don't care. They want to make money. They're moving to these new technologies, and they will continue to. It's not going to happen. There's going to be 2 steps forward, 1 step back. There's always going to be data points that show, they don't care. You can't make everybody care, but the majority does. So I'm not so worried about Coke. Coca-Cola, no, they're different. Yeah.
Hi, thanks a lot for coming. My name is Zach Andrews. I'm a first year at SOM. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about your bullet point under the partner pivot about inspiring customers to use less.
Yeah.
Separate from sort of the decoupling, which you talked about,
Yeah.
I think something that's even more heretical is, can we convince our customers to not buy as much stuff from us?
Right.
And does that even make sense at all in the consumer culture that we're in?
So yeah, it's a really important point, and I didn't really get to it much here, but it actually goes back to the B2B question, because so there's two different paths. So what I'm talking about is having that conversation about, can we help you use less of something, and have that be how we connect to you as a provider, because you want to use less, because because this is what you want as a customer. B2B is where this is actually happening, and I've used examples for years like waste management. There's a massive movement in business to zero waste to landfill goals, and they're moving very quickly, over 100 GM facilities. I mean, they're moving quickly. So waste management has been trying to convert itself from a hauling of waste company to a strategy company, right? That's helping you with waste management, help you recycle, help you design processes that create less waste, because that's what the customer wants. I use an example in the book of Kimberly-Clark. They sell the paper towels and things in bathrooms, in buildings. Companies want to spend less and less on stuff like that in procurement. So if they can help you use less paper per person, they're building a deeper connection to that customer, but it is against the normal, let's sell a bunch of cases. So it's a conversation about value of the customer. So, and I've used the example of Xerox. Xerox and HP are helping sell like multifunction printers instead of a printer in every office. That is saying print less. because they know that's what companies want. They want to save money. So they're doing it to maintain the relationship, right? It's better to disrupt the model than be disrupted and be taken out of the equation. In the consumer side, that's why I said inspire customers. The consumer side is far more rare, right? And you see Unilever talk about like showers and water use for their products. And you see Patagonia kind of always far out on the edge saying, don't buy this jacket. They ran this ad a couple years ago saying, only buy something when you need it. We'll make you something that lasts a long time, but only buy it if you need it. It's still really rare, but I think you're going to see increasingly leading brands have that conversation. And in that HBR article I did, they asked me at HBR to kind of talk about how do you grow in a resource-constrained world? What does that mean? How do you grow while shrinking? And part of it is stealing share. Part of it is changing what you're selling, servicizing, changing to a different business model so you're providing value in a different way that reduces resource use. There's a lot of different ways to think about it. But part of it is you're growing at the expense of others, at the competitors who don't get it, who aren't helping their customers use less. Yeah.
Thanks so much. I'm Rachel. I'm a second-year joint degree between FAS and SOM. And I'm interested in hearing about, so all of us are graduating in 1, 2, 3 years, right, and probably be in a mid-level position within a company, either mission-driven or not. And so how do you see us making the biggest impact in terms of pushing the company that we work for in this direction, even if they're not, this isn't on their radar screen, and maybe we have a CEO who isn't as brave as Apple saying, you know, don't invest in us.
Well, look, I think there's a lot someone can do as an employee, but you're not in charge. You're not the CEO, right? I mean, so I think it's about demonstrating how what you do, whatever you're doing in this company, whatever role you have, demonstrating how you can do it in a different way, bringing this mentality, bringing this sensibility to the table. But also it's about how, making the case internally, showing that what you're doing is good for business. You can't just come in and say, I got a degree at Yale and I care about the environment. It's just not going to be heard by most companies. It has to be done in a way that, is kind of the way I try to write these books and have these stories about this is good for business and here's why. And about broadening, what good for business means or what return means. I mean, it's having the language of business, right? But there's been a lot of examples of companies where, I gave the example of the waterless or apparel, or I use the story of UPS all the time, not taking right turns. Some of these, not taking left turns, these things come from people, in the company. Some of the best ideas come from, plant people on the floor of a factory or in a company when they're given the chance, right? There has to be, an open conversation or a chance to bring ideas to the table. But there's some of the best like innovation and efficiency stories don't come from the top, right? It comes from people closer to the business. So I think it's about bringing these opportunities to the foreground and bringing the ideas, but telling the story as a business story. And that's, that's what I can say about kind of coming in from the bottom until you're the CEO. Then you can change it. But you can also influence it as an employee and make this known, and as a consumer, just every day. What are you buying? We have to support companies like Unilever. Buy their stuff because they're doing the right thing. Yeah.
Hi, my name's Tamar. I'm a PhD student at the School of Forestry. And I have a question. You talk a lot about, the big corporations that are leading the way, and in general, very big companies. Where do you see small and medium businesses fit in? I mean, to them, eco-efficiency or stuff like that usually are, become very impactful with scale. Where do they fit in?
No, I mean but eco-efficiency works at any scale. I mean, using less. There's very little of any of the agenda in the work I do that doesn't fit small and medium. I mean, being more efficient works at all scales, really. But there is one category that's harder for the smaller businesses, and that is kind of the pressure on the supply chain. They don't have the clout for that. So they have to kind of ride with the larger people in the industry kind of pushing change. But their role, I think, and I use the example, in the quick story about the waterless technology, that was all small companies. Those new technologies came from small companies. The big guys can accelerate that technology. So I think the small guys can bring and can ask more heretical questions, like why is Tesla able to ask, do we need a combustion engine and not Ford or GM? Because they don't have one. Because they're smaller, they can start fresh. So I think the small companies have this critical role. But I talk about the biggest guys because there's a lot of statistics about number of employees at small companies, but the scale of impact is still entirely with the big guys, right? If we need to change the amount of carbon and water use in the economy, you got to talk about the big guys, right? They're top 200 companies in the world are like 30% of GDP. They're just enormous, ginormous to be technical. So you have to start there, but I think the innovation, the new heretical questions are going to come from the small and medium. They're the ones able to ask these questions. You see that from the startups, but they need to be accelerated. We can't wait till they get bigger. And that's where the big guys can come together with the smaller. Yeah. Sure, nothing's unfair.
We're becoming rapidly familiar with now since the United Nations FAO report on animal agriculture, that this is, it's the largest source of greenhouse gases, has, horrid effects on forests and water and so forth. Right. What kind of signs do you see in food service or other industries that they're turning on scale?
On the deforestation question in particular, or are they working on it? Or? Yeah, it's funny. No one wants to really hear that, but if asked about consumption, I usually get into that conversation with people about eating lower down on the food chain. But I will say that I was at an event in Mexico last week, and I was talking to one of the IPCC scientists, and he works on tropical forests. He's one of the Nobel guys from IPCC, and I was asking him for some good news. He said that in his work, he's seen that there's actually been incredible progress in Brazil, that he thinks they have kind of a handle on deforestation for agriculture, in part because I think they're getting much more efficient about using the land they have. That's part of it. But there's also been some big pushback from big ag companies saying, and I talked about goals, like science-based goals. There's a lot of the big food and ag companies that have goals and processes in place to limit deforestation. So there is pushback coming from the supply chain, from the buyers back to the supply chain, that seems to be having a real impact, that they're not going to source beef and soy from deforested land. So that's step one. Having the consumption conversation goes back to the asking consumers to use less. I think it's harder to take a steak out of people's hands than a gun. I mean, like I think I've had conversations with dyed-in-the-wool environmentalists, and and there's some I can name that are very famous who want a steak every time they get their hands on it. And I don't know how you have that conversation, to be honest. I've been a vegetarian for 25 years, but I don't know how you have that conversation because people think it's cultural and it's very personal. But I agree with you. I think you kind of have to have it. I don't think you feed 9 billion people very easily unless people are eating differently than we eat. But I think there's some positive movements. Meatless Monday, vegan before 6. Like there's some movements that seem to have some legs. No pun intended. But there's some movement. I honestly don't know how you have that conversation. It's so difficult. But I agree with you. Last question, I guess. Are we? Yep. People got to go to class. Sorry. Yeah.
I'm Michelle. I'm first year FES, and my question is: you spoke a lot about resources like water and forest deforestation. Yeah. What is your experience with ecosystem services within, as dialogue between companies and concerning this strategy?
Well, I mentioned on that slide about what we don't value, that there's the externalities, and there is work. There's the Puma did an environmental P&L a few years back. If you saw that work, where they tried to value all of ecosystem services in nature and what the value would have been in their business. There is work on this. There's a kind of big partnership between Nature Conservancy and Dow. It's been a $10 million partnership to try to value natural inputs. But the kind of dirty secret, and I dug into it for the book, is that they're not really valuing ecosystem services very much, even in that partnership. What they're doing is valuing green infrastructure versus gray infrastructure, meaning if we need to protect water supplies around our plant, do we just protect the lands we own around the coast or build a levee or both? And that's green versus gray. Gray is the levee, like construction. And they've compared the investment and the ROI, but actually in very traditional terms, like if we spend this to preserve land and we get this benefit to our business. And so they've called that kind of like ecosystem services, but they're only kind of on the side is the Nature Conservancy valuing and saying, well, also you're protecting watershed for the people in the area and flood protection, and they've put some numbers on that and said that's a community benefit. The problem we have is that natural system services are a classic externality. And for a business, an externality means they don't have to address it. Like, until you, and so I think, again, the reason you put a price on carbon or a price on water that's higher than it is so that you turn an externality into an internality. You know, like you can't deal with externalities in the way businesses run. Like there's no way for them to take it on to their books. And the reason Puma looks at it is to say, what are some risks? Like if you run out of water, it's a deep risk. But it's not, you see what I'm saying? Like it's very difficult. They're putting numbers on it, but it's not affecting business that much because it kind of can't in the current system. So I think that's why you need to put a price on things or kind of find other value that it creates. All right, so thank you.
Please join me in thanking Andrew. And if you haven't already, go out and pick up your copy of The Big Pivot.
The Big Pivot.
Yeah.